Have you ever wondered what makes someone become a monster? Not the kind that hides under your bed or lurks in the shadows of your closet. No, I'm talking about the real ones, the ones that walk among us wearing human skin. In 1888, London was about to discover exactly that, and the world would never be the same. Now, before we dive into this story, I need to warn you about something. What you're about to hear isn't just another true crime tale. This is the case that literally wrote the book on how we catch serial killers today. And trust me, the most shocking part isn't the murders themselves. It's how this mysterious killer accidentally created modern criminal investigation. Picture this. It's August 31st, 1888, and the streets of London's East End are covered in a thick blanket of fog. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and Whitechapel, one of London's poorest districts, is a maze of narrow alleys and dark corners. At 3:40 a.m., a cart driver named Charles Cross is making his way to work when he spots something in Bucks Row. At first, he thinks it's a tarpaulin. It's not. What Charles has just stumbled upon is the body of Mary Ann Nichols, and she's about to become the first confirmed victim of the most infamous serial killer in history. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean completely bonkers. The police who arrived at the scene had absolutely no idea what they were doing. Why? Because in 1888, there was no such thing as forensic science. Crime scene investigation didn't exist. DNA analysis wouldn't be invented for another century. They didn't even wear gloves at crime scenes. In fact, when the police photographer finally showed up to document the scene, he brought along his pet dog. Yes, you heard that right. A dog. At a murder scene. But wait, it gets better. The police surgeon who examined the body did so while wearing the same blood-stained clothes he'd worn to treat patients earlier that day. Cross-contamination? That wasn't even a word back then. Now, you might be thinking, surely they at least cordoned off the crime scene? No. By 5 a.m., workers were literally stepping over the crime scene to get to their factories. But here's the real kicker. This complete disaster of an investigation would eventually lead to the birth of modern forensic science. And it all started because of what happened next. Within the next 8 days, another woman would be found dead. Her name was Annie Chapman, and her murder was even more brutal than the first. But this time, something was different. The killer had taken something with him, and this single detail would change criminal investigation forever. You see, for the first time in history, detectives started to realize that criminals leave behind patterns. They started looking for similarities between the crimes. They began to understand that killers have signatures. Today, we call this behavioral analysis. Back then, they called it looking for the mad one. But here's what's fascinating. Everything we know about serial killers today, every profile, every pattern, every behavioral indicator, it all started with this case. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit? It exists because of what happened in Whitechapel in 1888. Those criminal profilers you see in movies? They're using techniques that were first developed to catch Jack the Ripper. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because what happened next would shock even the most hardened detectives of Scotland Yard. And it all started with a letter. A letter that would give this nameless killer the identity we all know today. A letter that began with 2 words that would become infamous. Dear Boss. Part 2, Dear Boss. I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. These words, scrawled in red ink, arrived at the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. And just like that, our nameless killer got his nickname. Because at the bottom of this letter, there was a signature that would become legendary. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Most people think this letter was the killer's first communication. It wasn't. The police had already received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the murderer. But this one was different. How different? Well, it predicted the next murder. And not just the murder. It predicted exactly how the victim would be mutilated. The police, naturally, thought it was a hoax. I mean, wouldn't you? They'd gotten so many fake letters that they'd started using them to wallpaper their office. Yes, that actually happened. Victorian police had a sense of humor, albeit a rather dark one. But then came September 30th, and with it, the double event. 2 murders. One night, 45 minutes apart. And exactly as the letter had described. Elizabeth Stride was found first, at 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard. But here's the thing. Her murder was interrupted. How do we know? Because 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. And what was done to her matched the letter's prediction exactly. Suddenly, that "Dear Boss" letter didn't seem like such a hoax anymore. The press went wild. Jack the Ripper was splashed across every newspaper in London, and that's when the real panic began. But here's something they don't teach you in history class. This case didn't just terrorize London, it fundamentally changed how we think about crime. You see, before Jack the Ripper, people believed that criminals were easily identifiable. They thought you could spot a murderer by looking at the shape of their head. I'm not joking. It was called phrenology, and it was considered cutting-edge science at the time. But Jack the Ripper shattered that belief. Because whoever he was, he looked normal enough to walk the streets of London without raising suspicion. He could blend in with a crowd. He could pass as respectable. And that terrified people more than any murder ever could. For the first time, society had to face a frightening truth. Monsters don't always look like monsters. This realization led to the development of psychological profiling. Instead of measuring skull shapes, investigators started looking at behavior patterns. They began to understand that it's not how a killer looks that matters, it's what they do. And speaking of what they do, remember that police photographer with the dog? Well, he accidentally invented crime scene photography. Not because he was a genius, but because he was lazy. You see, he got tired of drawing sketches of murder scenes. So he started taking photographs instead. And those photographs? They became the first standardized crime scene documentation in history. Today, every crime scene photographer follows procedures that were developed because one Victorian policeman didn't like to draw. But we're still not at the most incredible part of this story. Because on October 16th, something arrived in the mail that would haunt investigators for the next century. A small package. Inside, half a human kidney. And another letter. This one began, "From hell?" The letter claimed that the killer had fried and eaten the other half. Was it real? The kidney matched Catherine Eddowes' missing organ. But here's the twist. Medical students had access to human organs. And guess who else had access? Well, that brings us to the suspects. And this is where our story takes its wildest turn yet. Because the list of suspects includes everyone from a royal surgeon to an American conman. From a Polish barber to Queen Victoria's grandson. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the final murder. The one that was different from all the others. The one that made even hardened police officers sick to their stomachs. And the one that might actually tell us who Jack the Ripper really was. Part 3, November 9th, 1888. 13 Miller's Court, Whitechapel. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the other victims. She was young, just 25 years old. She had a room of her own. And what happened to her was so horrific that the crime scene photographs were kept locked away for almost a century. But here's what makes this murder truly fascinating from an investigative standpoint. It was the only indoor crime scene. The killer had time, privacy, and he showed us exactly what he was capable of when he wasn't rushed. The police report from that day is, well, let's just say it's not light reading. But it gives us something incredibly valuable, a glimpse into the killer's psychology. And this is where modern criminal profiling really begins. Because Mary Jane Kelly's murder wasn't just a crime. It was a performance. The killer took his time. He arranged things. He wanted someone to see his work. Today, we call this staging. It's one of the key things profilers look for at crime scenes. In this case, it's literally chapter 1 in FBI training manuals. But let's talk about why this final murder is so important to solving the case. First off, it breaks the pattern. All the other victims were killed outside, in the dark, in a hurry. This one was different. And differences tell us things. Important things. For instance, why did the killer suddenly change his hunting ground? Why take such a huge risk? And most importantly, why did the murders stop after this? Because they did stop. Just like that. No more letters. No more murders. Nothing. It's like Jack the Ripper simply vanished into the London fog. Now, this is where we get to the really good stuff. The suspects. And oh boy, are they a colorful bunch. First up, we have Sir William Gull, Queen Victoria's personal physician. The theory? He was conducting a royal cover-up involving Prince Albert Victor and a secret Catholic marriage. Sounds crazy, right? Well, wait until you hear about H.H. Holmes. Yes, that H.H. Holmes. America's first serial killer was actually in London during the Ripper murders. We know this because he was running from Pinkerton detectives at the time. And then there's my personal favorite, James Maybrick, a cotton merchant from Liverpool who supposedly left behind a diary confessing to the murders. The diary appeared in 1992. It contains details about the murders that were never made public. And here's the kicker, the ink has been scientifically dated to the 1880s. But wait, there's more. In 2014, a scientist named Jari Luhalainen analyzed a shawl allegedly found at Catherine Eddowes' murder scene. He found DNA. After 126 years, he found DNA. And it matched a suspect who wasn't even on the police's radar in 1888. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who lived in Whitechapel. The police actually knew about him. They had him under surveillance, but they couldn't prove anything. And now, over a century later, we might finally have our answer. Except, there's a problem. Several problems, actually. The DNA analysis hasn't been independently verified. The shawl's chain of custody is, let's say, questionable. And the diary? Well, let's just say there are some interesting questions about where it really came from. But here's the thing, maybe not knowing is better. Because Jack the Ripper isn't just a murderer anymore. He's become something else. A symbol of our darkest fears. A reminder that evil can wear a respectable face. And most importantly, he's the reason we can catch monsters today. Because of him, we have crime scene photography, forensic evidence collection, psychological profiling, criminal databases. Everything we use to catch serial killers today exists because we couldn't catch this one. So maybe that's the real legacy of Jack the Ripper. Not the murders, not the mystery, but the tools we created to make sure it never happened again. Tools that have caught hundreds of killers since. Tools that have saved thousands of lives. And perhaps that's the most fascinating thing about this whole story. Sometimes the worst of humanity leads to the best of human ingenuity. And there you have it. Our top most cruel serial killer in human history. Do you think we miss any names on the list? Let's hear from you in the comments section. And if you find this video interesting, subscribe to our channel to enjoy more videos like this. Until next time, stay safe,